Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Nash, and welcome to a wonderful webinar hosted by Drill to Frac with Kevin Wutherich. And what I really like about this is that this is a AEPG and Tulsa Geological Society. Want to say that this is also supported by the Division of Professional Affairs. And you see my background, I'm at the GSA, so I'm going to go on mute as soon as possible so that you won't have to hear a lot of background noise. But the signal's good here, and so that's all good. So Kevin, just thank you so much for being here. Kevin gave us a wonderful presentation this summer. If you're interested in watching that as well, I will send out a link to that recording as well as a link to this recording after we finish today. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Appreciate to be here. So, yeah, let me get my slides shared here. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that okay.
Yes.
All good? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Well, yeah, I really appreciate the chance to talk here. Especially, with the TGS. I just moved here to Tulsa about 3 years ago. So, hopefully I can get a little bit more involved with the TGS, and it all starts with sort of sharing a little bit of our all of the knowledge that we've been picking up over the last couple of years. And I think that's where the real value of these talks are, right? Is the sharing of learnings that we've had over the years. And I do work for Drill to Frac. I'm the CTO over there, but my goal of this is not really to try to get too much into the commercial aspect of what we're doing, but really just focusing on all the incredible information that is available during the actual drilling of the wells that we can use in order to improve what we do around completions, right? So my background is it's getting on about 25 years in the industry now. A huge portion of that was with Schlumberger. I think the first 15 years or so I was with Schlumberger. Started out actually in the field doing cementing jobs and fracking, got into sales and then really technical sales. Worked in the mid-con for a long time. Then I worked out in Europe and sort of ran things for continental Europe for Schlumberger. Moved up to the Northeast, Marcellus. And yeah, again, here with in Tulsa for about 3 years. So I've been with Drill to Frac for, what's it been? It's been about, I think 7 years now, right? So we'll talk a little bit about, what we've been doing there, what we've been looking at, but more importantly is just the data that is available that we can use on a lot of the stuff we're doing. So one thing was, I started out, again, 25 years ago, and back then, there's a little bit of horizontal going on, but the vast majority of work, especially in the fracture side of things, was in vertical wells. And again, in the mid-con, we were doing quite a bit of information, right? I mean, there wasn't very many wells that wouldn't at least have a triple combo on there or a quad combo. And we'd use that information to understand where we're going to complete the well, because a lot of times we'd be completing multiple zones. Understand height growth. I mean, we did put a little bit of science into each one and every one of those wells, but when we went horizontal, things kind of changed, right? Because it was no longer easy to get those wireline wells. They needed to be pumped down. You run into issues with, just the formation collapse, hole collapse. So it's a little bit of a risk anytime you're going to run open hole logs. You can do cased hole. But all of that starts to run into a lot more costs, right? So right these days when people are looking at horizontal wells and how they're going to actually design a completion, unlike what we used to do in the past when we were designing it on vertical wells where we had some logs, now pretty much all people are using is maybe they'll use the deviation survey. And sometimes it's just as simple as, hey, my first perforation is going to be when I hit 60 degrees into inclination, and I'll figure out where my last one is just based on, where I can put my toe sleeve and all that. And another thing, especially in the world of infill, other people are using right now is just the relative location of the offset wells, right? So if you know you've got a parent well on one side, a lot of times if you've got a pad of child wells, you'll frack the child well closest to the parent first, build up a stress shadow, and that's it. But other than that, the vast majority of horizontal completions today, and this is my experience with probably, I want to say at least 90% of the operators out there, they're designing the completion for the well and specifically the fracture design, how they're going to put the clusters, the stages, and everything. Before the well's even drilled, they know exactly what it's going to be because they're cookie cuttering it from well to well to well to well. And the reason they do that is because one, it's easy, and two, there's really not that much data out there in order to make some decisions, right? So they sort of try to use a one size fits all. It can, sometimes can be quite effective. Um, and I think as the engineers, deep down, we all need to be thinking that um, we can always improve on what we're doing, right? And the one way that we can improve is just understanding exactly what the rock looks like that we're actually drilled through. But the problem with that is that most people think that any type of data is going to be expensive and have operational challenges, like pumping down wireline tools, running wireline tools on drill string. All of that costs money, takes time, and is expensive. So we've really gone to sort of a one size fits all technique. But this is where drilling data comes in, right? Because the great thing about drilling data is you've got to drill this well. And because of that, why can't we take the information that's gained during the drilling in order to understand the rock properties? So this drilling data is usually available in real time as the well is being drilled. We could get all that information from the drilling rig, sort of how fast they're drilling, how much torque's on the bit, what the weight on bit is. All of that is important information. And we can get that either in real time or shortly after the well reaches TD. Um, Everything that you get from drilling data is stuff that's being reported already, right? These drilling rigs do a very good job of reporting this data, keeping it up into the cloud, and it's generally available to everyone at no additional cost. Anyone who has access to the data, so typically that operator. Again, since you're going to be drilling the well already and we're using data that's already available, there's typically no additional operational or HSE risk. So we're doing this data without having anyone on location. We're not running new tools down the hole. It's just using the data that is already available. And the other cool thing is, recently I started to compare what we get from drilling data to a triple combo, right? Because the triple combo or quad combo, when we used to get those back on the vertical wells, each individual measurement that you would get from that triple combo was somewhat useful on its own. But where the real value came is when you started connecting all of those together, right? Like what happens when the neutron density and the density porosity sort of overlap when they're crossing, understanding how that works with resistivity, right? When you start bringing all these different measurements together, you can really get a much better view of what's happening with the rock. And with drilling data, we get the same type of an advantage because we get multiple different pieces of information that I'm going to talk us through. And because of that, we can use that data to really get a good handle on what's happening downhole. The other thing people don't realize is that drilling data is actually relatively high resolution because if you think about it, as you drill each foot of rock, it takes several seconds to drill through a foot of rock. Sometimes, unfortunately, it can take a minute or two to drill through each foot. But because of that, if you get a reading every 1 second, you actually have a pretty high resolution data. So we do have to clean up noise and stuff. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it is in general pretty high resolution data. So what data are we talking about that's available on most wells? Being a group of geologists, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one, but we get the gamma ray, we get the real-time drilling data. This is the data that comes off the rig itself. A lot of times we'll have some sort of a cuttings analysis, analyzing the mud that gas that's coming up. and even looking at the geosteering interpretation is all things that are extremely useful when you're trying to design a completion, right? So I'm really trying to take all this information and talk to you about how we can use that to understand what's happening with our fractures as we're pumping them and the completion in general. So let's start with the gamma ray. So again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here with the geological group, but typically changes in gamma ray represent a change in clay content. And clay content has a very major effect on rock properties. So for example, some things that we see is that when you have high clay content, you typically will have more ductile rock, right? High Poisson's ratio, low Young's modulus. And those are obviously direct impacts on how fractures grow. And in addition, that's also going to significantly impact the in situ stresses, right? So your gamma ray right away can give you some type of proxy on your Poisson's ratio, Young's modulus, and in situ stresses. And sometimes it can be an indicator of other geological features too. So sometimes we've seen spikes in the gamma ray around fractures, for example, right? So are those mineral-filled fractures that potentially have that higher gamma ray signature? Could be just more kerogen. It could be a number of different things, but the thing is that gamma ray does give you an indication of some rock properties. And in the completion design, this becomes very important because clay content significantly impacts the fracture width and stress shadow, right? So again, the more ductile your rock is, you're going to be able to create much wider fractures, and that's going to have a much bigger effect on how your stresses transfer from cluster to cluster. And it's something that really should be taken into account when you're looking at your fracture design. So for example, fracture design that has, let's say, a cluster every 10 feet may work in one rock type that has low stress shadowing, but when you have high stress shadowing, you could start getting into the point where they're too close and they start pinching each other off, right? So understanding that really can give you some insight into your frac growth. Now, another piece of information that our company does specialize is using the drilling data to obtain rock strength. So the term mechanical specific energy has been in use for a long time, and it's really just how much energy it takes to drill each foot of rock. And we do that by looking at things like your weight on bit, RPM, torque at the bit, etc. And it's made up of two different things. So the mechanical specific energy is essentially the confined compressive strength of the rock divided by the drilling efficiency. And if we can normalize changes in the drilling efficiency, so every time there's a change in drilling efficiency, for whatever reason, bit wear, changes in mud flow properties, changes in clean out, bit bounce, sliding, those are all changes in drilling efficiency. So if we can identify them and correct for them, we get the rock MSE, which is now proportional to the confined compressive strength of the rock. So essentially by cleaning up the drilling data, we can get a good view of what the compressive strength of the rock is. And compressive strength in terms of what it does to the completion significantly and directly impacts the breakdown pressure of the rock, as you might imagine, and also changes fracture growth. And I'll show a couple examples of that. Now, another cool thing that we discovered a couple of years ago is that when we look at the rock MSE, there's sometimes very small anomalies in the rock strength that we can't really explain. You don't see a change in lithology around a bit, or the response is much bigger than what the geological change should allow. And we built a whole process to identify those. And what is happening around those is that when you have a pre-existing fracture, there's typically going to be a depletion halo around it. So you've got this pre-existing conduit, you're pulling from it, perhaps from another well, and you get this depletion around the fracture face, right? And that depletion, especially in shales, might be anywhere from 5 to 20, maybe 40 feet away from the fracture, right? So here's an example of, down at the bottom, we have the gamma ray. This is our rock strength that we got, that rock MSE. And here's where we identified these areas of localized depletion. And this is kind of an interesting example because you can see that there's a lot more depletion happening where there's these faults. And that's probably not unexpected because where you have faults, your rock tends to get broken up a little bit more, much easier to have maybe even some pre-existing fractures not created by hydraulic fracturing, or just some planes of weakness. So we do a lot of times do see more depletion around these pre-existing fractures. The other neat thing is that we can a lot of times see that here's the parent well, the two child wells. Here are the areas of depletion that we saw. And we can see some really neat things here. So why is this important? It's important because these pre-existing fractures, when you're trying to frack a new well, if you've got a cluster near one of these, that cluster is going to take a lot more fluid, right? Because it's a pre-existing pathway, doesn't have to break any new rock path of least resistance. We can also use these signatures to understand frac growth from the parent well. So if we analyze what happened on this parent well, we can see that there was a lot more fractures reaching this well at the toe, but they didn't reach the far well. But over here, they reach both the near and the far, but you don't see as many of the fractures. You can also see how they line up. You essentially get the exact same pattern here and here. And this azimuth is actually the exact azimuth of the stress direction, right? So we can use this information to understand frac direction, essentially how fracs grow between wells and all that other stuff. Finally, the other reason this gets important is because we know this is a pre-existing conduit to another well, we can adjust our completion design just to make sure that we don't have perf right around these pre-existing fractures. Just very quickly on mud gains and losses, this is another piece of information that we can get. Here, what you're seeing is we've got the mud gas trapped. So this is percentage of the different components, the light blue being C1, this is being C2, C3, and there's a really dark one that represents C4. Yellow line is the total gas. We've got the rock strength in red. This is the gamma ray. This is the location of fractures. And this is the mud losses. So you can see that about 2/3 of the way down the well, they started to see a lot more mud losses. It really sort of starts right here where we see these pre-existing fractures that we identified. And you can see some changes in the mud gas probability or properties through here. And at that point, they started to have a lot of mud losses. Then interesting over here, they got a little bit of a kick. And with that kick, again, we see that there were some fractures identified there. And there's an increase in the total gas, which is this yellow line, right? So there was more gas showing up, a bit of a gas kick, and we see some fractures, right? So this is all some really useful information. So when we see these high fluid loss, it could mean that maybe there's some low strength rock there and we're getting some, natural or drilling induced fractures. Maybe it's a high permeability. Maybe there's some natural fractures, like in this case, that could be drinking a lot of your fluid. Where you have fluid gain, like right here, that could be an indication that maybe there's some overpressure going on, right? And the reason this is important is that while everything up here looks pretty normal, like what you might expect, there's obviously something different going on here, right? Something is behaving differently. So when we're fracturing these wells, if we believe that this is maybe some higher perm area and that's why they're losing it, you may want to consider changing your frac design. So maybe it's going to be putting a higher pad volume. Maybe it's going to mean that you want to, any number of things, reduce your total prop con. But this type of information can really start giving us information on saying, hey, this well is not going to treat identical. Something different happened here. Something different happened here. Now, how can we use that to our advantage to actually adapt our completion design to what's happening in the wellbore? As you guys are well aware, when we do get cuttings, it also can be useful information, understand sort of the lithology of the different areas, helps us understand and put context to all the other measurements we have. But one of the issues with this is that the resolution is generally fairly low, somewhere around 30 foot. And obviously, as you're transporting these cuttings up to surface, there's going to be some smearing going on. How they collect the samples, what they do, are they averaging them, etc., creates a bit of a smearing effect. So while a lot of our data that we get sort of from the direct drilling is sort of like 1 foot resolution, 2 foot, 3 foot resolution, This cutting data is sort of a 30-foot resolution, so it does sort of limit how actionable the data is, but it does give insight into some of the other data that we have. Mud gas, another thing that we typically will get. We get the total gas from the mud, and we get the components of all the different, or the ratio of all the different components, C1, C2, C3, C4. And from that, we can build sort of a ratio of, what the composition of the gas is, what percent is C1 versus C2, C3, C4. Again, it's relatively low resolution data, and we need to do a bunch of normalization because this data can get really messy as it's affected by ROP, your pump rate, your stands, a whole bunch of stuff. But when you can clean this up, it's really good because it can actually indicate where you have some compartmentalization, where you've got maybe when you have a decrease in C1 ratio versus the other components. We do see that around depletion. And surprisingly or not, the ratio of the different gas correlations often has a very different, or often has an effect on how the well treated. So when we look at analytics, it's not that unusual to see that as your ratio of C1 to C4 changes across the well, a lot of times those different stages in those areas actually treat different. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. That's just sort of a general observation that we've been seeing. So the last thing I want to talk about is just general geosteering interpretation. So we typically do understand where we are within the strat section, so we can start to see about how that changes things. So for example, here, when you're in the top of the target, you can see that in general, we've got low gamma ray and low rock strength, see a number of these pre-existing depleted fractures. As they start moving down towards the bottom of the target, you can see the gamma ray stays pretty constant, but now the rock strength is getting harder. So even though gamma ray looks very similar, we are getting a very distinct change in the rock strength properties as you get a little bit lower in there. We get down to the bottom of the target, now the rock MSE gets really low. We can see a couple areas where the gamma ray gets really low. But then as we start to get back up into that middle part, you can see that, again, it's sort of looking kind of like what it is at the top, even though we're a little bit lower, not seeing as many areas of depletion through here. Again, so we can start to understand how things are changing through the strat section. And it's important to note that, you can't just use gamma ray because there are other lithological changes besides just clay content happening. And that's why it's really good to look at the combination of those rock strengths and the gamma ray in conjunction with one another, as well as all the other information that we have. And obviously, where you're in, if you're trying to complete a well in this rock versus this rock, there's a good chance that they're going to complete very, very different. Along the same line, structure has a huge impact on fracture growth. So there's been a couple papers written probably almost 10 years ago that talked about the impact of anticlines and synclines. So when you have an anticline, you get sort of a bit of a compaction down here and more of a expansion up here, right? As those layers are bending at different amounts. So because of that, when you have an anticline, you tend to get a lot of fractures around it, and you tend to drive more upward growth because you have compaction here and the opposite up here. And the opposite around a syncline. When you're in a syncline, you're more likely to get downward growth. So that again has a huge impact on how your frac grows, how many stratigraphic columns you're going to break into, and etc. And this is just another really cool image on a project we did earlier this year. What you can see here is in the background, this is a seismic map, and it's meant to show curvature as well as the faults that were located, which are right through here, right? So what was really interesting is that when we're on this side of the fault, notice how, I don't have the scale here, but green means much higher strength rock, so higher compressive strength rock. And then when you go to this side, this well still has the higher higher strength rock, but as it moves away from the fault, it gets lower strength, and we see those lower strength through here. And even in general, as you get into the, I believe blue is positive curvature, through the positive curvature, you get these higher strength greens. But when you get into more relaxed areas, we tend to see more of the yellows. And the other interesting thing is as you were going through the fault here, we tend to see this right at the fault, this sort of weakening. So you see this sort of red oranges. We see that going through all of these faults, right? As you go through the fault, generally there's this little bit of a weakening right around it. So just really interesting about how these faulted features can impact the rock strength. And as a result, that can very significantly change your fracture growth and pressure response. So with the last about 10, 15 minutes of the presentation, I'd really like to go into bring all this data together and show you how this is affecting our fracture designs, how it's affecting our completions. So let's start out with something easy, and it's something that I don't typically like to do, which is show, not really a cross plot, but just looking at two different values in isolation. So from the geology side, we have the average rock strength is sort of this yellowish orange graph, and it's changing on stage by stage. So it starts at stage number 2 and at stage number 35. And you can see that it jumps up and down for each stage. So that's the average rock strength throughout that stage. And when you look at the average treating pressure, yes, it's not going to be exact, but we can see that it is absolutely following that same trend, right? So again, it's why I don't really like cross plots, because a cross plot will highlight where this doesn't match, this doesn't match, this doesn't match. But in general, you actually do get a very, very good match going through here. But on another well, you can see that there is sort of a general match. We can see there in a lot of areas, they are going the same place, but in other areas, we're getting a completely different signature. So the average treating pressure in this case was a lot lower in some areas than other areas. And this is where this gets really useful, right? Because to me, where I really want to look is where does this relationship fall apart? So when I look at the actual well down here, again, this is the rock strength, and this is the location of identified depletion. So these are pre-existing fractures, sized by the magnitude. And what's interesting here, there we go, is that if you look at a lot of these low points here, we can see that they are all around areas where we have pre-existing fractures. So what that's telling me is that in the absence of fractures, the treating pressure would likely be following the rock strength in the near wellbore. And again, this is just a near wellbore measurement, but near wellbore measurements have a huge impact. So we could see it's following here, but where we start to lose that correlation, and typically we're seeing low rock strength, for the most part, those areas line up with stages that were located in areas of localized depletion. So we can imagine that all of the, or a portion of the fluid that's being pumped in goes into these pre-existing fractures. Because of that, you can't create as much net pressure. And as a result, you have these sort of lower average treating pressures. So along the same lines of that, let's look at the actual slope of the pressure development. So as you're pumping your frac job, pressures change. A lot of times, maybe the pressure will go up during the job. Sometimes it will go down. And what we plotted here is the slope of the pressure response in blue. But then we made a function that essentially said, if we've got a positive slope, so the pressure is increasing during the job, that typically is happening around areas of low heterogeneity. So the rock properties aren't changing much throughout the job. If you have a negative slope, so you're losing pressure during the job, we typically saw that around areas of high heterogeneity. And if the pressure slope was staying constant, we saw that that was typically happening around depleted fractures. So we built a function taking that into account. And we tried to predict what the pressure slope should look like based on that information. And you can see that based on the amount of heterogeneity in the well, we were doing a pretty darn good job in being able to predict what the slope of the pressure development will be. And again, even though I'm showing this as sort of a one-to-one relationship across plot, if you might say, we have to remember that there are so many things that impact those slopes. And this is just luckily an example where the number one thing impacting it really was the amount of heterogeneity. It may be different things in different wells. Here's another image where we took some data from one of our partners, Fracture ID. And one of the things that they will do is look at the FDI magnitude. So how big is the impact of the frac hit on the parent well based on what's being pumped on the child well. So these are child wells here. We see the rock strength. So yellow is generally a little bit harder than the orange rock strength. And very, very clearly, we can see that if you were to plot the FDI magnitude, so the magnitude of the frac hit, with the value of the rock MSE, clearly as we get into stronger, more competent rock, we tend to have much more impact on our FDIs. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because when you have a stronger rock that tends to be a bit more brittle, and because it's more brittle, you're going to have less frac width, etc. You have much more chance of these fractures becoming more planar, longer fractures. And so it's not unsurprising that when you're initiating in these areas of higher rock strength, you actually get a better or a higher FDI magnitude. Now, this is kind of one of the really key points. So one of the things that we like to do is when we analyze a well, we like to average what the rock properties are across each fracturing stage. So for each one of the stages here, we say, okay, based on the well trajectory, this is the average inclination, the azimuth, how much dogleg severity is in there, was there sliding intervals where they were steering, then what the average gamma ray is, average rock MSE, and average heterogeneity. And from that, we can also say, okay, based on that well, how many standard deviations is that stage away from the mean of the whole well? So we can start to highlight areas that have, for example, more than 2 standard deviations of rock properties, from the other one. So here, heterogeneity was 210, which is more than 2 standard deviations from the whole well norm. And then we sort of give you a total hazard here. But the last one is kind of interesting. So here we actually take a risk probability. So this is what your chances of this stage being a problem stage is. So the way we did that is we had a set of wells here that had a number of problems associated with it, where pressures were really high, so they couldn't get to rate, couldn't get to max prop con, screened out early, whatever the case may be, or took an excessive time to get the job pumped away. So we took that data and we looked at all these rock properties, and we did a quick look to find out which of these rock properties is most associated with the problem stages. And from that, we could start to now bin the stages based on those properties. Then when we built a new well, we can create those same bins. And now we can say, okay, based on this rock type that we were in, there on the offset wells that had problems, there was 21 stages that had those same properties. And of those 21 stages, 62% of them had issues getting the job pumped away, right? So here with these 21 stages, you are at a higher risk of having problems getting those jobs pumped away, as opposed to down here, we had 32 stages that were binned in this type of rock. And of those 32 stages, only 28% had problems. So again, it just sort of allows us to see, okay, what was different about those stages? If you look at all of these 4 bins that had problems, all of them had high heterogeneity, right? So is it perhaps that high heterogeneity that is causing those type of issues? And as we start building a database, look at 100, 200 wells, we can really start to nail that down a little bit more. So a couple more slides here. The other place this gets interesting is when we combine it with other diagnostics. So here we have an image log. So some images were run. Green is conductive fractures, I believe. Red is resistive fractures. Maybe a blue in there that's a mixed fracture. So by itself, it doesn't really mean too much. But when we start bringing all this drilling data, so we've got the total gas that we got from the mud gases, the gas fractions, C1 to C4. So C1 is light blue, C2, C3, C4. And this is the localized depletion that we got from the drilling data. So wherever we saw it took a little bit more energy to drill through the rock. And we went through our whole process. We were able to identify these as localized depletion and possible fractures. And what was really cool in this one is, and this is the best example we have. So it doesn't always look like this, but anywhere where we saw localized depletion from the rock strength, for the most part, we saw this drop in the C1. So C1 was less prevalent and a drop in the total gas. We believe that's because C1 is the smallest hydrocarbon, most easy to produce, and we see fractures right there. And you can see that that works pretty much on every one of these. So when you start bringing all that data together, we can really see some interesting things. And the next thing we did is once we had that, we could understand, okay, which one of these fractures are associated with depletion and which one of these fractures do not have depletion associated with it. We can now sort of start to look at them individually. So let's look at the depleted fractures. So these were all fractures that were imaged that had depletion associated with it versus non-depleted fractures. So one thing should become very, very um, easy to see is that where there was depletion, we tended to see a lot more of these on echelon fractures. So we would see 2, 3, sometimes 4 fractures all next to each other, typically within a half foot to 2 feet apart from one another, all growing very closely together, right? And we saw that over and over and over again. The other thing that we tended to see on depleted fractures is a lot of times you would get this conductive, they were conductive fractures, but you'd have this resistive halo around it, right? So you see this little bit of whitening around the fracture itself that we obviously didn't really see on the non-depleted fractures. So our thought here is that this could potentially be related to that depletion that we talked about earlier, the C1 being preferentially produced. And what you're left with is a little bit of a higher weight hydrocarbon behind, which is probably going to be a bit more resistive, right? So what we're actually seeing here, maybe those changes in those fluid properties in this rock showing up as this little bit of a halo, resistivity halo. Now in the non-depleted, you can see that typically we didn't see those on echelon fractures. Most of them were just a single fracture. And as opposed to seeing this resistive halo, we actually saw this conductive halo. So we saw this dark smudge around the vast majority of these single fractures. So my thought there is that it could well be that the frac fluid went into these fractures, but then perhaps it leaked out into formation. So they weren't able to produce these fractures back, maybe not enough width. And because there was not enough width, you just couldn't get that water produced, so it just leaks off in formation. And again, I'll just do a little bit of conjecture here. I think there's been a lot more work that does seem to back up that where we have productive fractures or prop-filled fractures, we're more likely to see these on echelon fractures. My personal thought about what's happening, and I think this, I'm always up for discussion, but just to get people's brains moving, is that I think that here we are actually creating a tensile fracture, right? Like what we believe is sort of typically what happens in hydraulic fractures. But when you create enough width, I think what happens is that this rock right above it and below it needs to deform in order to accept that widening of this fracture. So then you have shear failures around the main fracture, right? So I think that's what we're seeing. And my thought is that only one of these is likely to be very productive, prop filled, while the others are actually just a, hydraulically induced fractures that may or may not be propped according to whether or not, maybe these are connected somewhere. But again, just really interesting stuff that we wouldn't be able to know unless we looked at comparing this with the drilling data. So my very last example here, and I think that's gonna get us finished right around on time, is we did some work on the HFTS2 trial. And this is obviously such a rich data set that it really behooves us to sort of understand how our data correlates with some of this other stuff. So to start with, very similar to my last example, there was an image log on these wells, and it's the same type coloring. I think we've got green is conductive, red is resistive frac, and I don't know if green is mixed or the other way around. But what was really interesting there is, okay, here we've got the cuttings analysis, here we've got the mud gas, the rock strength that we get from drilling data, and this is the depletion that we get from our drilling data. Virtually every single resistive frac that was imaged lined up with a depleted frac, right? So that right away is telling you something. Is why is it that we are getting this response that shows depletion only around resistive fracs? Yeah, it does happen in other areas, but why are the resistive fracs the only ones that are, or why is almost 100% of resistive fracs have depletion associated with it? You're also going to note it here, and like we saw in the other example, there is this change in gas composition, right? So the C1 is the light blue, and you see that there is a decrease, uh, a minimal C1 concentration pretty much at the center of every one of these fractures. And again, it happens on almost every single one of those resistive fractures, right? So again, shows you the value of putting all this data together. The gases, the mud logs, looking at the depletion effects, and then taking some other diagnostic. So the other thing that was interesting is that when you look at the well for HFTS2, we modeled here where the areas of localized depletion were. And on this well over here, they did a really neat study, which I hadn't heard of before. But as they're drilling this well, they sifted through the mud data and looked for proppant in the mud data. So as they're drilling this well, the thought was that they could be very well drilling through pre-existing fractures, and those fractures could be proppant filled. So is there a correlation between where they find proppant and pre-existing fractures? So the number one surprise they had is that they saw proppant way up in the heel, even though it was believed that all of the production was coming from these two parent wells over here. So they were quite surprised to find proppant in the well here, which they were also surprised that we actually saw depletion in these wells over here, right? So what was interesting is that if you look at the stress direction, even though we didn't see depletion anomalies through here, we absolutely can draw a line from where we saw depletion anomalies over here and where they saw this proppant breaking through. So it's very possible that a fracture grew all the way over to here. Maybe there was some proppant there, but maybe they just couldn't get the drawdown to this area, so couldn't produce through it. So we don't see depletion, but that is absolutely where they saw the proppant show up. And then as you go down to these areas, you can absolutely see that all the spikes where they saw a spike in proppant located in the drilling mud, almost all correlate to areas where we saw localized depletion, right? So it just gives a little bit of a little bit more information on why they potentially saw proppant across those areas. You know, is there something that we could do proactively to better understand what's happening? And as you can see, there really kind of is. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up. We've been talking for about 45 minutes now, but it really comes down to that, while completion engineers in general, a lot of times think that they're in the dark and that the best way to complete a well is to just assume we're going completely blind and adapt a one size fit all. There's really a lot we can do to adapt completion designs to the actual well drilled. And when I talk about adapting, it's saying that, okay, what do we change when we're in an area that was a lot of mud losses? What do we do when you've got some faulting that creates compartmentalization? Does it make sense to have one stage straddling that fault? Or should we have one stage on one side versus the other? When we recognize these areas of localized depletion, can we do something to help minimize those FDIs? It can give us a lot of information to help determine optimal drilling targets. For example, if you have a lot of problems getting jobs away in one type of rock, we can understand what that rock looks like, get some more insight on why you may be having problems there, and then work with drilling departments, reservoir engineers, and geologists to say, okay, based on all of this additional knowledge, is there a better drilling target? Maybe we don't drill through it as fast, but we obviously won't have as much problems completing it. We can understand and mitigate fracture interactions. That's a lot about what we do at our company right now, just understanding where those pre-existing fracture corridors are and trying to avoid putting clusters near them. And of course, if you have any other type of diagnostic, the near wellbore can give you so much additional information to it. I'm talking fiber optics. If you've got microseismic, you're doing tracer surveys, you're doing camera surveys, other types of logs, understanding what's happened during the drilling process across those same intervals and getting some interpretation done on it can really help your full understanding of what's happening and really just allow us to make much better decisions. Obviously, I talked about how a lot of these different things impact fracture response. And, just to finish it off, this data, everything I'm talking about here is probably available on 75 to 80% of all wells being drilled. So we're not talking about running a whole new suite here. We're not talking about adding $200,000 to your AFE. And for the most part, even for the completions group, you can make slight adjustments and just adapt what you're currently doing to the rock that was drilled, right? So there really is a very, very low cost information that we can get. Use this to start building some high level analytics, building big data cubes that say, okay, what's my average pressure? And then what's all the rock properties and get that at a stage level. Most of this data is actually foot by foot resolution. So we absolutely can get stage level resolution that matches the stage level resolution of the completion responses. So again, really good information to add to your completion analytics. So with that, appreciate you guys listening to me. Appreciate you getting on this call, helping to, hopefully some of this was of interest to you. And now I'd love to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Kevin, we do definitely have some questions. I don't know if you managed to see them in the chat. So the first one, and there's one in the Q&A also, but there's a question to ask you to explain depleted fractures. Once again, is there a relationship with the clay composition of gamma ray / DFI?
Yes, so let me just get up to there. It's actually really cool how we came up with this, right? Because the way this all started is that as we were drilling wells, because we'd been looking at rock property strength drilling data for several years, and we started to notice that there was these strange anomalies happening on offset wells, right? And they would only happen on offset wells. So what we came to realize, and it's something that drilling engineers know quite well, is that the rock strength, or not the rock strength, the amount of energy it takes to drill through a section of rock is significantly impact between the difference in your mud weight and the reservoir pressure, right? If your reservoir pressure, the higher the difference between your reservoir pressure and the rock or your mud weight, and that's of course circulating density, the bigger that difference is, the less energy it takes to drill through it, right? Because that rock wants to actually break on its own. It's got so much pressure within those pore spaces that it wants to break on its own. So if you deplete some of that pressure, then it takes more energy to drill through it. So if you can look at the mechanical specific energy that we get from drilling data and clean up all of the drilling artifacts, and there's a lot of drilling artifacts, but if we can do a good job cleaning that up, there's a residual spike that happens. And we've built an entire workflow around identifying where those spikes are, comparing that to every other piece of data we have, the geosteering. We look at it in context with other wells. We look at what's happened within the drilling. We look at the gamma ray. And from that, we can understand what the probability of each one of those anomalies is of being depletion. And not only that, we can actually calculate the magnitude of that depletion too. So that's where we're getting that information. And it's something we've been doing now for about, what is it, maybe 5 years. And we've got a really good track record of doing it. So it's actually pretty high confidence data that has a pretty good resolution. It's probably about a 3 to 5 foot resolution on identifying those.
Well, that's great. So we have a couple of other questions. We have something in the Q&A that says organics have a large impact on ductility. How do you allocate if clay or organics?
That's a really good question. And first of all, I'm going to say I'm not a geologist, right? So I don't want to go into any specifics, right? I think the value of that to me is really understanding that there are a lot of things that this clay content can give you, right? So one of the thoughts, for example, is that when we actually compare that to the rock strength, we do expect that if there is a difference in clay content, you will get a change in your rock strength, right? And typically we do see higher gamma ray, more clay, meaning that you have lower strength rock, right? Every once in a while, we see that flip where higher gamma ray can result in higher strength rock. So when you start bringing all that together, along with mud logs and everything, I do believe that there probably is some possibility that we could go through that and actually start saying, okay, this spike in gamma ray could be caused by a change in clay content, while this spike in gamma ray is likely due to a change in kerogen, while this one may be something completely different. So I do believe there's a lot of information within the drilling data that can help us to differentiate with those, but again, I think that would take some strong geologists and working with those geologists and core samples and cutting samples and making that good correlation. And obviously that's going to change from play to play, formation to formation. So that's a really good question.
So we have one in the chat. We'll jump over to lots of questions, but this is one. Let's see, trying to get to it here. Okay, how long is the turnaround time for you to provide a completion plan after you're provided with the logs, geosteering report, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. And again, I didn't really want to make this into a sales presentation, so I don't want to go too much into that. I'd be more than happy to follow up if there's some sales interest in it. But in general, the process itself takes 3 to 4 days. We try to automate as much as we can. Of course, there's always limitations based on backlog and stuff like that. But we are trying to get that timing down. I think that the goal would be to try to get all of this information in a customer's hand within 5 to 6 hours really would be ideal. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of what we're looking at. There's a lot of automation and there's so many variables in that, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so in a well Wutherich drilled to ? What kind of rocks were they drilling through? Homogeneous silicic plastic or mixed?
Sorry, was that for a specific slide? Sorry, I'm just trying to.
Well, maybe they can clarify. As we're mulling over that one, let's go to the next one. To calculate MSE, you need downhole RPM, but usually you only have surface RPM. How do you determine downhole RPM?
Yeah, good question. So downhole RPM and torque are typically, I mean, okay, so there's two ways that you can do it, right? The most common way of doing that is by using the differential pressure and your mud rates at the surface, right? So if you know the motor configuration, you know how much pressure drop across that motor versus the rate through that motor relates to RPM and torque, right? So we can use surface readings in order to gain that. Now, there's a number of things that need to be done to clean that data up. And that's where it does become very useful to work with a company and specializes in that, right? We're not the only one that does this. There are other companies out there that will attempt to correct for those type of things. The other method is to use a downhole measurement tool, right? So there are tools that will go on the end of your bit and give you that data in real time. Obviously, there's a little bit more cost with doing that, a little bit more risk. I think our experience is that you probably do get slightly better resolution by doing that, but the improvement in resolution is not extremely significant, right? So yeah, it's something that you do have to do some work to clean out. And it's not trivial, but it can be done and can be done effectively.
Excellent. Okay, so have you used spectral GR and a color cube for correlation? Or have you used color cubes to identify changes using any three curves? Have you analyzed changes in clays using hyperspectral analysis? So those are related, so choose the one that you.
No, that's a really great question, because absolutely there is room for doing that. As a company, we haven't gone into that realm quite yet, right? We're dabbling in it. You know, whenever you do that, I think there's definitely more information that can be gained by doing that. So again, our strength is really understanding the drilling data part of it. And I think with some strong geologists, you know, and that's really what it comes down to, right? And that's why I love talking to geologists. I mean, the guys that you're talking to within our company are completions guys. We've got petrophysicists, we've got you know, drilling people. But when we talk to really good geologists to help understand that, the guys who understand their own play, this is the type of information that I really think could help them better understand their rocks, you know, and should potentially be part of that understanding process. But as of right now, I think that there's a lot that could be done there. It's just not something that we've really dipped our toes into.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. The one thing with a color cube is you can integrate any three curves, which gives you a resulting color, which the human body or human mind ability to recognize patterns with color is incredible. And that's the advantage of the color cube. And it particularly works absolutely fabulous if you can get a spectral gamma ray. for telling your clay types.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, we start to do that a little bit with, you know, and again, I'm not overly familiar with color cubes, but we kind of try to do that with our completion hazards, right? By sort of doing some color coding through here. A lot of times we can start to see where we've got, you know, especially when you put in completion hazards, we'll say, okay, what stages did you screen out on? What properties do they have in common? You know, but you know, you're absolutely right. There's so much more that could be done with all this data to better characterize it. And I do think that's where the future of this is going to go, right? Because yeah, I mean, I've got to say, as a completions guy, I was just blown away by how much information is actually available in the drilling data, right? And how that relates to how our completions actually perform. So I really think I'm scraping the tip of the iceberg, and we really want to work with more operators that are willing to learn from this and let us help be part of that better understanding. So it's an excellent point. Absolutely.
I'm not an expert in color cubes, but there are a few out there, and I think they could help you a couple orders of magnitude.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm going to look into that for sure. Thank you very much.
Well, we're kind of out of time. Unless you want to make one more stab at Parabok's question about whether you're drilling through homogeneous, siliciclastic, or mixed lithologies on one of the slides at the beginning of Q&A.
So, yeah, again, I'm not sure exactly which slide it was.
Well, maybe you get
hello, you just passed the slide. Is the one with the title drilling data? Yeah, that one.
Okay. Yeah, so I would have to go back on it. It is trying to remember what formation that was. I don't even remember what formation. I'm guessing it was a Woodford. Yeah, sorry, a wolf. It kind of looks like a wolf camp from what I'm seeing here, one of the upper wolf camps. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly, to be honest.
Because lithology, as you know, has a lot to do with the.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it absolutely does. And
great,
and
thanks.
again, this one was just kind of neat because we do see sort of these faults going through here, and that's where we see a lot of our localized depletion, right? So this is where we think that, you know, we see this all the time. Wherever you do have faults, we're much more likely to see localized depletion around those areas. Just rock more broken up in those areas typically, and those become those natural conduits. So it's again something that I think completion engineers would do so well to take that into account and understand more.
Well, I think we're out of time. We just want to thank everybody. This was great, and lots of engagement, lots of questions, and thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, no problem. Again, it was a pleasure talking to everyone, and really appreciate everyone who stayed on with us.
And just a reminder, you'll get a copy of the recording in an email. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.